back for another episode of our Ultimate Lease Accounting series. So last video, we covered the basics of operating lease accounting, including a step-by-step example. During this session, we'll focus on the practical expedients available to ease your transition to ASC 842. Let's get started. Lease Query has several resources regarding the transition to ASC 842. You may be tired of hearing about it, so I will just say that regardless the size of your organization, the transition project should ultimately consist of the following steps. 1, inventory your leases. 2, make a plan for recording all your leases on the balance sheet as lease liabilities and right-of-use assets. And then 3, execute your plan in time to meet your compliance deadline. I know, it's not really that easy, but those are the steps. Compiling the lease inventory is by far the most time-consuming and resource-intensive part of transitioning. But by breaking the task up into smaller, manageable steps, using our resources and following some simple tips learned from prior transitions, the process can become manageable. To create a lease inventory of all your organization's leases, obtain listings of leased assets from all entities, departments, and locations, and also a listing of recurring payments from accounts payable. Then obtain copies of all contracts from all the entities, departments, and locations, etc. Evaluate all your contracts to determine whether they are in scope and determine the classes of underlying assets. Set a materiality threshold and ensure all appropriate contracts are included in your inventory listing. It would also be helpful to communicate any of your preliminary conclusions, assumptions, estimates, policies, etc. with your auditors. And finally, a discussion of transition is not complete without mentioning practical expedients. Practical expedients are options or elections offered by the accounting boards for the purpose of easing the adoption process. There are several related to ASC 842, and they can be divided into a couple of different categories. Let's first discuss the package of practical expedients. This is 3 practical expedients that must be elected all at once for transition and cannot be elected individually. So the first one is no reassessment of lease classification. This one means that entities can opt to not reassess the lease classification of existing or expired leases under ASC 842 and simply maintain the original classification that was made under ASC 840. The caveat here being that errors under ASC 840 are not exempt. So in other words, if an error in classification occurred under ASC 840, it would also be treated as an error under 842. The second practical expedience in this package is the reevaluation of existing or expired leases. So entities can elect to not reevaluate whether expired or existing leases contain a lease per the definition of ASC 842. Again, similar to the practical expedients above, this assumes no errors were made in your previous evaluations. The last practical expedience for this package is no reassessment of initial direct costs. Entities can opt to not reassess previously capitalized initial direct costs. This can save time at transition due to there being a slight difference in how initial direct costs are defined between ASC 840 and ASC 842. The definition under ASC 842 is narrower, so a reassessment of the cost could possibly lead to an income statement or equity adjustment. Again, these 3 together are called the package of practical expedients and must be elected together, not individually. Determining the correct discount rate for ASC 842 can be difficult and time-consuming for all entities. So it stands to reason that several practical expedients exist for discount rates. The first is the incremental borrowing rate. Any entity that is unable to determine the rate implicit in the lease is able to elect to use their incremental borrowing rate, or IBR. Then, private entities are given an additional expedient to elect to use a risk-free rate by class of underlying asset. The risk-free rate is commonly thought of as the US Treasury bond rate and is therefore usually much more readily available than the implicit rate or the IBR. The last discount rate practical expedient is related to application. Entities can choose to apply rates on a lease by lease or portfolio basis, saving the effort of determining discount rates for each individual lease. One thing to consider when determining discount rates above the resource savings to the organization is the impact to the balance sheet. In a present value calculation, the lower the interest rate, the higher the present value return. This may not be a big deal, but if your leases and debt are monitored closely by stakeholders, you may want to understand the impact. The discount rate will also have an impact on the lease classification test between operating and finance lease. Combining lease and non-lease components. This expedient means that lessees and lessors do not have to go through the process of separating lease components and allocating costs between lease and non-lease components. As an example, if a payment is supposed to be for $10,000 for base rent and maintenance combined, but separate amounts are not assigned to the base rent and maintenance costs, if you're not electing the expedient to combine the lease and non-lease components, then the lessee should use standalone observable rates to allocate the $10,000 between the base rent and maintenance, a process that may prove challenging. So while electing to combine lease and non-lease components will save time and ease the transition to ASC 842, combining these amounts will produce larger payments, which will result in a higher lease liability and may impact the lease classification as well. So again, if you're paying specific attention to your lease liabilities and your liability side of your balance sheet in general, you may just want to know the impact of not combining these components. Besides those three categories of practical expedients, there are a few others. Hindsight. The hindsight practical expedience allows lessees and lessors to determine the lease term and value of the right-of-use asset at commencement by applying judgment based on the information available now through the effective date of the new standard, instead of only what was known at commencement. If elected, though, lessees and lessors must apply this practical expedient to the entire portfolio on a lease-by-lease basis. The land easement practical expedient allows companies to elect not to reassess existing or expired land easements for a lease under ASC 842. Instead, the current accounting can stay in place. However, this expedient does not apply to land easements classified as leases under ASC 840 and is only applicable to land easements existing before the adoption of 842. So any modifications to existing leases and or new land easements entered into after the effective date of transition must follow the guidance as described by ASC 842. And lastly, the allowed short-term lease exemption. Leases with 12 months or less at commencement do not have to be capitalized but can be expensed as incurred. This is also looked as a practical expedient for its impact on implementation.